The morning sun barely touched the windows of the palace when Kate felt the familiar weight settling in her chest. She had known for weeks now that something was terribly wrong. The doctors had confirmed what her body had been trying to tell her, but she had kept it hidden, buried beneath her duties and her smile. Today was different, though. Today she would finally speak the truth. William had noticed the change in her. How could he not? They had been together for so many years, through so much. He watched her more carefully now, his eyes following her movements around their private quarters. She moved slower these days, with a deliberation that spoke of pain she wouldn't acknowledge. But Kate had always been strong, perhaps too strong for her own good. The palace walls held many secrets, but none quite like the one Kate carried. She had scheduled a family gathering, something simple and private. George, Charlotte, and Louis would be with their tutors for the afternoon. This conversation needed to happen away from innocent ears. She had asked William to meet her in the small sitting room, the one with the view of the gardens where they had shared so many quiet moments over the years. Camilla arrived earlier than expected. She had a way of appearing when least wanted, her presence announced by the soft click of her heels on the marble floors. Kate heard her talking with staff in the hallway, her voice carrying that particular tone of authority she had grown into over the years. Since becoming queen consort, Camilla had settled into her role with a comfort that some found admirable and others found concerning. Kate stood by the window, her hand resting gently on the frame. The gardens were in full bloom, a riot of colors that seemed almost offensive in their vitality. She remembered planting some of those flowers with the children, their small hands covered in soil, their laughter filling the air. Those memories felt both immediate and impossibly distant now. William entered the room with his characteristic purposeful stride, but his expression softened when he saw Kate. There was love there, deep and genuine, the kind that had survived scrutiny and pressure that would have crushed lesser bonds. He moved to stand beside her, his hand finding hers naturally, their fingers intertwining as they had 1,000 times before. Camilla followed moments later, her entrance more calculated. She chose the chair nearest the door, crossing her legs and smoothing her skirt with practiced grace. Her eyes moved between William and Kate, reading the room with the skill of someone who had spent decades navigating the complex currents of royal life. Kate turned from the window to face them both. Her face was pale, thinner than it had been months ago, but her eyes held a clarity that commanded attention. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times, but now that it was here, the words felt heavier than she had imagined. The room fell into a silence that was almost tangible. William's hand tightened around Kate's, an unconscious gesture of support and growing dread. He knew his wife well enough to recognize when she was gathering courage for something difficult. His mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Kate began to speak, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. She told them about the doctor's appointments she had attended alone, the tests she had undergone in private. She spoke of the diagnosis that had changed everything, the words clinical and precise as if distance might make them easier to bear. The cancer had spread more quickly than anyone had anticipated. The treatments had failed. The time she had left could be measured in weeks, perhaps a handful of months if fortune was kind. William's face transformed as she spoke. The color drained from his cheeks, his jaw tightened, and his eyes filled with a pain so raw it was almost unbearable to witness. He tried to speak, to interrupt, to protest against the reality she was laying before him, but no words would come. His throat constricted, his breath caught, and all he could do was hold on to her hand as if that alone might keep her anchored to this world. Kate continued, her composure remarkable given the weight of what she was sharing. She talked about arrangements she had made, letters she had written for the children to open in the years to come. She spoke of her wishes for their future, her hopes that they would remember her not as someone who had left too soon, but as someone who had loved them with every fiber of her being. The practical details spilled out next. She had already spoken with her private secretary about the transition of her patronages. The charities she had championed would need new advocates. There were plans to be made, protocols to be followed even in death. The machine of the monarchy would continue turning, indifferent to the personal tragedies that fueled it. William finally found his voice, though it came out broken and desperate. He spoke of second opinions, of experimental treatments, of specialists around the world who might offer hope where others had found none. His words tumbled over each other in a rush to build a reality different from the one Kate was describing. He couldn't accept it, wouldn't accept it. There had to be something they hadn't tried, someone they hadn't consulted. Kate placed her free hand on his cheek, a gesture of infinite tenderness. She had expected this reaction, had prepared herself for his denial. She explained that she had already pursued every option, consulted with the best doctors across 3 continents. This wasn't a decision made in haste or ignorance. This was simply the truth of her situation, as much as she wished it were otherwise. Camilla remained silent throughout the exchange, her expression carefully neutral. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, watching the scene unfold before her with the detachment of someone observing a play. There was no shock registering on her features, no tears threatening to spill. Her face remained a mask of composure, perhaps even calculation. The afternoon light shifted through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. Kate spoke of wanting to spend her remaining time with her children, of creating memories they could hold on to when she was gone. She wanted to take them to Anmer Hall, away from the formality and constraint of palace life. She wanted them to run through fields and climb trees and simply be children for as long as possible. William was breaking apart piece by piece. Each word Kate spoke seemed to chip away at his foundation, leaving him crumbling. His shoulders began to shake and tears finally spilled down his cheeks, unchecked and unashamed. This was his wife, his partner, the mother of his children, and she was telling him she was leaving. Not by choice, not by any fault, but leaving nonetheless. Kate's own eyes glistened, but she didn't let herself cry. Not yet. She needed to remain strong for this conversation, to see it through to its necessary end. There would be time for tears later, in private moments when the weight of what was coming could be fully felt. For now, she had to be the steady one, the strong one, even as her own heart was shattering. The silence that followed her final words was profound. William couldn't move. He sat frozen in place, his world collapsing around him while the sun continued to shine through the windows as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Everything. The future he had imagined, the years they were supposed to have together, the growing old side by side, watching their children have children of their own. It was all disappearing like smoke in the wind. He looked at Kate, really looked at her, and saw all the small signs he had been too busy to notice or too afraid to acknowledge. The way her clothes hung a little looser, the shadows under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide, the moments when she thought no one was watching and her face would settle into lines of pain and exhaustion. How had he missed it? How had he been so blind? Kate moved closer to him, wrapping her arms around his trembling frame. She held him the way she had held their children when they were frightened, with a strength that seemed impossible given her fragile state. William buried his face against her shoulder and let himself break completely. His sobs came in great shuddering waves, each one tearing through him with devastating force. Camilla watched this display of raw emotion with an expression that flickered between discomfort and something harder to define. She uncrossed her legs, recrossed them the other way, her fingers drumming lightly on the arm of her chair. The tick of the clock on the mantel seemed unnaturally loud in the spaces between William's sobs. When William finally pulled back, his face was red and swollen, transformed by grief into something almost unrecognizable. He tried to speak, but his voice kept breaking, words fragmenting before they could form complete thoughts. Kate wiped his tears with her thumbs, her touch gentle and familiar. She had known this would destroy him, but there had been no kinder way to deliver such news. Camilla finally spoke, her voice cutting through the emotional atmosphere like a blade through silk. She asked about the practicalities, about what the public would be told and when. Her tone wasn't cruel exactly, but it carried a businesslike quality that seemed jarringly out of place. William's head snapped toward her, his eyes widening with something between disbelief and fury. Kate answered before William could say something they might all regret. She explained that the announcement would be carefully managed, that there would be time to prepare the children and the public. She had already discussed the framework with her private secretary and the palace communications team. Everything would be handled with dignity and respect for everyone involved. But William couldn't stay silent. His grief was transforming into anger, hot and desperate. He turned on Camilla with words that had been building for years, accusations about interference and coldness, and 100 small cruelties that had accumulated like stones in his chest. Kate tried to calm him, but he was beyond hearing her now, beyond caring about protocol or propriety. Camilla's expression hardened. She straightened in her chair, her own composure cracking to reveal the steel beneath. She reminded William that she had also lost people she loved, that death and grief were not unique to his experience. Her words were sharp, calculated to cut, and they found their mark. William recoiled as if physically struck. The argument escalated quickly, years of unspoken resentment spilling out in harsh exchanges. Kate found herself in the middle, trying to separate them with her diminishing strength. She pleaded for peace, for dignity, reminding them both that this wasn't the time or place. But grief and anger had taken over, transforming the quiet sitting room into a battlefield. Camilla stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She said things that couldn't be unsaid, observations about Kate's choices and William's emotional weakness. The words hung in the air like poison, contaminating everything they touched. William responded in kind, his voice rising to a shout that echoed off the walls. Kate's voice finally broke through, louder than either of them had ever heard it. She demanded silence, commanded it with an authority that came from somewhere beyond her physical strength. Both William and Camilla stopped mid-sentence, turning to look at her with surprise. She stood there trembling but unbowed, her eyes blazing with an intensity that brooked no argument. She told them both exactly what she thought. She spoke of disappointment and exhaustion, of having spent years trying to bridge gaps that perhaps were never meant to be crossed. She addressed William's protectiveness and Camilla's defensiveness, pointing out how both had contributed to the toxic dynamic that poisoned family gatherings and private moments alike. Her words were honest in a way that royal life rarely permitted, stripped of diplomatic softening. William tried to apologize, but Kate wasn't finished. She spoke of wanting peace in her remaining time, of needing her family to come together rather than fracture further. She acknowledged the complicated history, the wounds that hadn't healed, but insisted that none of it mattered now. Not anymore. She didn't have time for petty conflicts or old grudges. She needed them to be better, for her sake and for the children's sake. The room fell silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. Shame and regret mixed with the grief, creating a complex emotional atmosphere that pressed down on all of them. William looked at his hands, unable to meet Kate's eyes. Camilla turned toward the window, her jaw tight, her shoulders rigid with tension. Kate sat down slowly, the outburst having cost her more energy than she could spare. Her hands shook slightly as she folded them in her lap. She looked older somehow, as if the confrontation had aged her years in mere minutes. William moved to sit beside her immediately, taking her hand again, his touch apologetic and gentle. Camilla remained standing, her back to them both. Her reflection in the window showed a face struggling with competing emotions. Whatever she was feeling, she kept locked behind the careful mask she had perfected over decades of public life. But there was a tightness around her eyes, a tension in her jaw that suggested the mask was harder to maintain than usual. Kate spoke again, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. She outlined what she needed from both of them. She wanted William to be strong for the children, to help them through what was coming without falling apart himself. She wanted Camilla to support William in the ways he would need, to be present and helpful rather than critical and distant. She was asking them to set aside their differences and focus on what truly mattered. William agreed immediately, promising anything and everything she asked. He would do whatever she needed, be whoever she needed him to be. His desperation to please her, to make her final months as peaceful as possible, was written across every feature. He would have promised her the moon if she had asked for it. Camilla's response was slower in coming. She turned back from the window, her face carefully composed once more. She spoke of respect and duty, of understanding the gravity of the situation. Her words were formal, measured, lacking the warmth of William's promises, but carrying a commitment nonetheless. She would do what was required of her, what was appropriate to the circumstances. Kate nodded, accepting both responses for what they were. She knew she couldn't fundamentally change the people in front of her, couldn't erase years of complicated history with a single conversation, but she could set boundaries, establish expectations, and hope that love and duty would be enough to see everyone through the darkness ahead. The afternoon was fading into evening when Kate finally stood to leave. She needed to rest, to conserve her energy for the dinner she had planned with the children. William stood with her, his arm around her waist, supporting her more than she wanted to admit she needed. They moved toward the door together, a unit despite everything. The following weeks passed in a strange blur of normalcy and quiet crisis. Kate insisted on maintaining as much routine as possible for the children. Morning breakfast together, walks in the garden, bedtime stories read in voices that tried not to shake. George, at 12, had started to notice that something wasn't right. He watched his mother with increasingly worried eyes, asked questions that Kate deflected with practiced ease. Charlotte, sensitive and perceptive at 10, had actually asked her mother directly if she was sick. Kate had held her daughter close and told her a carefully edited version of the truth. Yes, she was unwell. Yes, the doctors were helping. No, Charlotte shouldn't worry too much. The lie tasted bitter on Kate's tongue, but she told herself it was a kindness. Let them have a few more weeks of innocence before the world came crashing down. Louis, still so young at 7, remained blissfully unaware. He chattered about football and his friends at school, showed his mother drawings, and demanded she admire his handstands on the lawn. Kate treasured these moments, storing them away like precious jewels to examine later when the pain was too much, and she needed reminders of why life had been worth living. William tried to hold himself together, but the cracks were showing. Staff members whispered about finding him in Kate's study late at night, sitting in the dark, just sitting. He threw himself into work during the day, attending engagements with a ferocity that surprised his team. Anything to keep moving, to avoid the crushing reality waiting for him in quiet moments. His relationship with Camilla had grown even more strained after their confrontation. They maintained civility in public and at family gatherings, but the warmth that had slowly developed over years had frozen over. Charles noticed the tension and tried to smooth things over, but he was caught in an impossible position between his wife and his son. Camilla, for her part, seemed to retreat into formality. She performed her duties with precision, attended the necessary functions, said the appropriate things. But there was a distance to her now, a wall that hadn't been there before. Some interpreted it as respect for the gravity of the situation. Others saw it as emotional unavailability at a time when family should draw closer. Kate's parents arrived from Berkshire, their faces showing the strain of helplessness. Carol Middleton moved through the palace like a ghost, trying to be useful while her heart was breaking. She helped with the children, organized Kate's correspondence, and cried in private where her daughter couldn't see. Michael stood as a quiet pillar of support, his usual jovial nature subdued by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The medical team came and went with increasing frequency. Pain management had become the primary concern now. Kate refused to spend her days in a fog of medication, insisting on staying as alert as possible for the children. But the nights were different. The nights were when she allowed herself to take the stronger doses, to escape into dreamless sleep that offered temporary relief. There was a particular evening when Kate felt stronger than she had in days. She asked William to take her to their favorite spot in the gardens, a bench tucked away behind the rose bushes where they could be almost completely private. The summer air was warm and filled with the scent of flowers. They sat together in comfortable silence at first, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. William spoke about memories, recalling their university days when everything had seemed so much simpler. He talked about the first time he had known he loved her, really loved her, and how terrified he had been by the intensity of that feeling. Kate smiled, remembering her own fears about loving someone whose life was so public, so constrained by duty and expectation. She told him things she needed him to know. That he had been the love of her life, that she had never regretted choosing this difficult path because it meant choosing him. She spoke of pride in the man he had become, the father he was to their children. She made him promise to find happiness again. Eventually, when the grief had dulled to something manageable, he protested, but she insisted. Life was for the living, and she needed to know he would truly live once she was gone. They talked about the children, about how to help them through the coming loss. Kate had written letters for each of them to open at different stages of their lives. Birthdays, graduations, weddings, the births of their own children. She wanted to be present for those moments in whatever way she could. William held her tighter, his tears falling silently into her hair. Inside the palace, Camilla stood at a window overlooking the gardens. She could see William and Kate on their bench, two figures hunched together against the gathering darkness. Charles came to stand beside her, following her gaze. He commented on how difficult this must be for everyone, how heartbreaking to watch. Camilla's response was measured. She acknowledged the tragedy of the situation, the terrible unfairness of it all, but her tone lacked the deep emotion that might be expected. Charles looked at her with something like concern, asking if she was all right. She assured him she was fine, just trying to maintain appropriate boundaries given the circumstances. But the truth, which Camilla would never admit aloud, was more complicated. She had never fully warmed to Kate, had always felt a subtle competition for affection and position within the family structure. Kate's perfection, her effortless popularity, her easy relationship with the public, all of it had been a quiet rebuke to Camilla's own struggled acceptance. And now, watching Kate face death with such dignity, Camilla felt a confusing mixture of respect, resentment, and shame that she couldn't quite untangle. The palace had begun quiet preparations for the inevitable. Protocol dictated certain procedures, certain announcements, certain periods of mourning. Staff members worked behind closed doors on plans they hoped wouldn't be needed for months yet, but feared might be required much sooner. The machinery of monarchy prepared itself for transition and loss. Kate's patronages began the delicate process of preparing for change. The charities and organizations she had championed worked to ensure her legacy would continue beyond her lifetime. Initiatives she had started would be completed in her name. Causes she had supported would find new advocates. Though none could quite replace the genuine passion she had brought to her work, media speculation had begun to swirl. Though the palace had released no official information, Kate's reduced public appearances had been noticed. Photographs analyzed, rumors whispered. The press office worked overtime to manage inquiries and maintain privacy for as long as possible. But everyone knew the truth couldn't be contained forever. George had started having nightmares. He wouldn't talk about them, but William would hear him crying in his room late at night. The boy was old enough to sense the approaching storm, but too young to fully understand or process it. He clung to his mother during the day, finding excuses to be near her as if proximity alone could protect her from what was coming. Charlotte had grown quieter, more withdrawn. She spent hours in her room, writing in journals that she hid away from everyone. Kate knew her daughter was trying to process fear and grief in the only way she knew how. She made sure to spend special time with Charlotte, just the two of them, talking about everything and nothing. Louis remained the bright spot, his innocence and energy a gift to everyone around him. He made his mother laugh with his silly jokes and elaborate stories. Kate soaked up every moment with him, knowing these memories would have to sustain him through the difficult years ahead. William had stopped sleeping properly. Kate would wake in the night to find him watching her, his eyes reflecting whatever dim light filtered through the curtains. She would reach for his hand and he would hold it like a lifeline, as if his grip alone could keep her anchored to this world. They rarely spoke during these vigils, the silence saying everything that words couldn't capture. The decision to make a public announcement came sooner than anyone had hoped. Kate's condition had deteriorated faster than the doctors had predicted, and speculation in the media had reached a fever pitch that threatened to spiral out of control. The palace communications team worked around the clock to prepare a statement that balanced transparency with dignity. Kate insisted on recording a video message herself. She wanted people to hear the news from her, in her own words delivered with the grace and strength that had defined her public life. William tried to talk her out of it, worried about the physical and emotional toll it would take, but she was adamant. This was her story to tell, her truth to share. The video was filmed in the garden she loved, surrounded by the flowers she had planted with her own hands. Kate wore a simple dress in her favorite shade of blue, her hair softly styled, her makeup carefully applied to give her face some color. She looked beautiful and fragile all at once, like something precious that might break at any moment. She spoke directly to the camera, her voice steady and clear. She thanked the public for their years of support and kindness. She explained her diagnosis with clinical precision, avoiding drama while not softening the reality. She talked about her focus on spending quality time with her family and asked for privacy during this difficult period. Most importantly, she spoke about hope, about finding meaning and beauty even in the darkest times. The video was released on a Tuesday morning. Within hours, it had been viewed millions of times. The response was overwhelming. Flowers began arriving at palace gates in quantities that staggered the staff. Cards, letters, and messages of support poured in from around the world. People who had never met Kate felt connected to her through years of watching her in her public role, and now they grieved with her. The media response was largely respectful, though there were inevitable exceptions. Most outlets ran thoughtful pieces about Kate's life and work, celebrating her contributions while acknowledging the tragedy of her illness. A few tabloids crossed lines of decency, publishing speculative articles that were quickly condemned by press watchdogs and the public alike. William released his own brief statement, thanking everyone for their support and asking that his family be given space to navigate this challenging time. Behind the carefully worded sentences, those who knew him could sense the barely contained anguish. He was trying to be strong, trying to hold together, but the weight was crushing him slowly. Camilla found herself in an unexpected spotlight. As the Queen Consort, her response to the situation was scrutinized. She attended several public engagements in the days following the announcement, and at each one she was asked about Kate. Her answers were appropriate, expressing sadness and support, but they lacked a certain warmth that people seemed to expect. Social media picked up on this perceived coldness. Comparisons were made between Camilla's measured responses and the obvious devastation visible in William's public appearances. The narrative began to shift, with some commentators suggesting that Camilla wasn't properly supporting her stepson during his darkest hour. The palace tried to push back against this narrative, but public perception had already begun to crystallize. Kate was aware of the swirling controversy, but tried not to let it consume energy she didn't have to spare. She had more important things to focus on. She was working with her private secretary to finalize the distribution of her personal effects, ensuring that meaningful items went to the people who would treasure them most. Jewelry for Charlotte's future milestones. Cufflinks for George when he was older. Special toys and books marked for Louis. She recorded video messages for the children, one for each year until they turned 21. In them, she spoke about her hopes and dreams for them, offered advice and encouragement, shared stories and memories. The recordings took everything out of her, both physically and emotionally, but she persevered. These messages would be her voice reaching across the barrier of death, a way to remain present in their lives even when she was gone. William struggled to be in the room when she recorded them. The first time he tried to stay, listening to Kate talk to their future teenage children, to their adult children, he had to leave halfway through. The reality of all the moments she would miss, all the years she wouldn't see, was too much to bear. He spent that afternoon walking the palace grounds alone, his security detail trailing at a respectful distance. Relations between William and Camilla reached a new low when she suggested, during a family meeting about logistics, that perhaps the public grieving period should be carefully managed to avoid excessive disruption. William had exploded, accusing her of being more concerned about appearances than about actual human suffering. Charles had tried to mediate, but the damage was done. Kate had called Camilla later that evening, asking her to come for a private conversation. Camilla had been reluctant but couldn't refuse a dying woman's request. They met in Kate's private sitting room, just the two of them, no staff within earshot. What passed between them that evening remained known only to the two women, but Camilla left looking shaken, her carefully maintained composure cracked. The next day, Camilla's public statements about Kate took on a different tone. There was more emotion, more genuine feeling. She spoke about Kate's strength and grace, about what a wonderful mother she was, about how much she would be missed. The change was noticed and commented upon, though no one knew what had prompted it. Kate's parents had essentially moved into the palace, unable to bear being away from their daughter during her final weeks. Carol spent hours sitting with Kate, sometimes talking, sometimes just holding her hand in silence. They looked through photo albums together, remembering happier times. Kate's childhood, her wedding day, the births of her children. Each memory was precious now, weighted with impending loss. Pippa visited frequently, bringing her own children to play with their cousins. Kate treasured these visits, watching the children run and laugh together. She made Pippa promise to help William and the children after she was gone, to be present in their lives, to keep the Middleton family connection strong. Pippa agreed through tears, barely able to speak. The medical team had begun discussing hospice care. Kate's pain was becoming harder to manage, and the doctors felt she would be more comfortable with specialized end-of-life support. William resisted this conversation with everything in him, unable to accept that they were truly at this stage. But Kate, ever practical, understood the necessity. She wanted to be comfortable, wanted her last days to be as peaceful as possible. A decision was made to move to Anmer Hall, away from the formality and scrutiny of palace life. Kate wanted to be in the countryside, surrounded by the landscapes she loved with her family close. Arrangements were made quickly, medical equipment transported, staff relocated. The move happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon. The house felt different with all the medical apparatus, but Kate found comfort in being back in this more intimate space. The children could run freely through the rooms and gardens without the constant awareness of staff and protocol. William could let his guard down, could grieve and rage and break without worrying about who might see or hear. Kate spent her days in a chair by the window, watching the children play outside. She was on stronger pain medication now, which made everything feel slightly distant, slightly unreal, but she fought through the fog to stay present as much as possible, to soak in every moment she had left. One evening, as the sun was setting and casting golden light across the gardens, Kate asked William to bring the children in. The three children gathered around Kate's chair, sensing something important was about to happen. George sat closest, his young face already showing signs of the man he would become. Charlotte curled up near her mother's feet, small and scared. Louis climbed into Kate's lap, his weight feeling both heavy and perfect against her weakened frame. Kate looked at each of her children, memorizing faces she already knew by heart. She had prepared what she wanted to say, had practiced in her mind countless times, but now that the moment was here, the words felt inadequate. How do you say goodbye to your children? How do you prepare them for a loss they're too young to truly comprehend? She started with the simple truth. She was very sick, much sicker than they had been told before. The doctors had done everything they could, but sometimes even doctors couldn't fix things. Her voice remained steady, though it cost her everything to maintain that steadiness. The children needed her to be calm, to be the mother who had always made them feel safe. George's eyes filled with tears that he tried desperately not to shed. At 12, he was caught between childhood and adolescence, between needing to cry and wanting to be brave. Kate reached out and touched his face, telling him it was okay to cry, that she needed him to let his feelings out rather than bottling them up inside. Charlotte began sobbing immediately, her small body shaking with the force of her grief. She understood more than Louis, old enough to grasp the finality of what her mother was saying, but young enough to believe that loving someone enough should be able to save them. Kate pulled her daughter close, letting her cry against her shoulder, whispering words of comfort that felt hollow even as she spoke them. Louis looked confused, his 7-year-old mind struggling to process what was happening. He asked when his mother would get better, when the doctors would find the right medicine. Kate's heart shattered as she explained as gently as possible that she wasn't going to get better. That soon she would have to go to sleep and wouldn't wake up again. But she would always love them, would always be watching over them from wherever she went next. William stood in the doorway, witnessing this scene, his hand pressed against his mouth to stifle the sounds of his own breaking. He wanted to run to them, to gather his family in his arms and shield them from this pain. But this was Kate's moment, her goodbye to their children, and he couldn't intrude no matter how much it destroyed him to stay separate. Kate talked to them about memories, about holding on to the happy times they had shared. She reminded George of their trips to Scotland, of teaching him to fish in the streams near Balmoral. She recalled for Charlotte the secret tea parties they used to have in the garden, just the two of them, with real china and imaginary guests. She told Louis about all the books they had read together, all the adventures they had taken without leaving his bedroom. She made them promise things, promise to be kind to each other, to support one another through the difficult times ahead, promise to be good to their father, who would need their love and patience as he learned to navigate the world without her, promise to live fully, to take chances, to find joy even when joy seemed impossible. George asked if it hurt, if she was in pain. Kate lied, telling him the doctors kept her comfortable. The truth was that pain had become her constant companion, a relentless presence that no amount of medication could fully eliminate. But she would spare her children that knowledge, would let them believe she was peaceful and calm. Charlotte wanted to know what happened after someone died. Kate drew on every ounce of faith and hope she possessed to paint a picture of something beautiful beyond this life. She spoke of watching over them like a guardian angel, of always being in their hearts even if they couldn't see her. She didn't know if any of it was true, but she needed to give her daughter something to hold on to. Louis asked the simplest and most devastating question. He asked if she loved them. Kate pulled all 3 children close, her arms barely strong enough to hold them but holding them nonetheless. She told them she loved them more than all the stars in the sky, more than all the grains of sand on all the beaches in the world. Her love would never end, never fade, never diminish. It would exist beyond death, beyond time itself. The children cried together, their mother holding them as darkness fell outside and the room grew dim around them. William finally moved from the doorway, coming to kneel beside the chair, his arms encircling his entire family. They stayed like that for a long time, locked together in shared grief and desperate love. Eventually, Kate's parents came to collect the children for bed. George resisted, not wanting to leave his mother. Kate promised him she would be there in the morning, that this wasn't goodbye yet. He left reluctantly, looking back 3 times as Carol gently guided him from the room. Alone with William, Kate finally let herself fully break. She cried with a rawness she had been holding back for weeks, for months. The grief of leaving her children, of missing their futures, of all the moments she would never witness, poured out of her in wrenching sobs. William held her, cried with her, his own anguish mingling with hers until it was impossible to say where one ended and the other began. They talked late into the night about practical things and impossible things, about funeral arrangements and whether she thought there was something after death, about his promise to eventually move forward with his life, and her wish that he remember their love without being trapped by it, about gratitude for the years they had shared and rage at the unfairness of those years being cut short. Kate extracted promises from William too, that he would make sure the children knew their mother, not just as a figure from photographs but as a real person with quirks and flaws and humor, that he would show them the video messages at the right times, not too early but not delayed out of his own pain, that he would let them see him grieve, so they knew it was okay to grieve too, that he would find help when he needed it, wouldn't try to carry everything alone. William promised it all, though he had no idea how he would keep those promises. How did you go on when your world had ended? How did you be a father when you felt like a child yourself, lost and terrified? But he would try. For her sake and for their children's sake, he would somehow try. The days that followed blurred together. Kate's lucid moments became fewer, the medication stronger as the pain increased. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes aware of who was with her and sometimes lost in dreams or memories. The family gathered around her, taking turns sitting by her bedside, talking to her even when she couldn't respond. Charles and Camilla came to visit, driving up from London despite the media presence camped outside the gates. Charles was visibly emotional, this woman who had brought such stability to his son's life now slipping away before his eyes. He held Kate's hand and thanked her for everything she had been to William and the children, for the grace she had brought to the family. Camilla stood back, letting Charles have his moment. When he finally stepped away, she moved closer to the bed. Kate was asleep or unconscious, her breathing shallow and labored. Camilla looked at her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Whatever complex feelings existed between them, whatever resentments or tensions, Camilla seemed to be trying to set them aside in this final moment. Kate stirred slightly, her eyes opening briefly. She looked at Camilla with a gaze that, despite the medication, still held clarity. They locked eyes for just a moment, and something passed between them. Understanding, perhaps, forgiveness maybe, or simply acknowledgement of the complicated truth that existed between them, all the things said and unsaid over the years. Then Kate's eyes drifted closed again, and Camilla turned away. Charles was ready to leave, to give the family privacy. As they walked toward the door, Camilla glanced back one more time at the woman lying so still in the bed, at William slumped in a chair beside her, at the evidence of a grief that was about to consume an entire family. The end came on a Tuesday morning, just as dawn was breaking over the Norfolk countryside. Kate had been unconscious for nearly 2 days, her breathing growing progressively more labored despite the oxygen and medication. William hadn't left her side, his hand constantly holding hers, as if his touch alone could keep her tethered to life. The children had said their final goodbyes the evening before, though they didn't fully understand that's what it was. Kate had briefly opened her eyes when Charlotte kissed her cheek, had seemed to smile slightly when Louis whispered that he loved her. George had sat beside her for an hour, holding her other hand, his young face ancient with grief. They had been sent to bed around 10, Kate's parents taking them despite their protests. Carol and Michael had stayed through the night, sitting in the corner of the room, present but not intrusive. They watched their daughter slip away with a pain that defied description. No parent should have to watch their child die regardless of age. The natural order had been violated, and the wrongness of it permeated every breath. The medical staff monitored Kate's vital signs with quiet efficiency. The doctor had warned William that it wouldn't be long now, that her body was shutting down system by system. She wasn't in pain anymore, they assured him. She was beyond pain, drifting in some space between life and death where the body's suffering couldn't reach. William talked to her constantly in those final hours. He told her about the Children's Day, what they had done and said. He reminded her of trips they had taken together, moments they had shared when the world wasn't watching. He told her she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, that knowing her had made him a better man. He apologized for things left unsaid, for times he had been too busy or too focused on duty. He thanked her for choosing him, for giving him their children, for every single day they had shared. Around 5 in the morning, Kate's breathing changed. The pauses between breaths grew longer, each inhalation sounding like it took monumental effort. The doctor moved closer, checking monitors, but there was nothing more to be done. Nature was taking its course, and medicine had done all it could. William felt the change in her, some subtle shift he couldn't name but knew in his bones. He pulled her hand to his lips, kissing her fingers over and over, whispering desperate words of love. Carol had moved to stand behind him, her hand on his shoulder, grounding him in reality even as his world dissolved. At 6:17, as the first rays of sunlight touched the window, Kate took a breath and didn't take another. The silence that followed was absolute, profound in a way that felt almost sacred. William waited for the next breath, convinced it would come, unable to accept that she was simply gone. But the monitors told the truth his heart refused to believe. The quiet, steady beeping had become a single continuous tone. The doctor moved forward to officially confirm what everyone in the room already knew. Time of death, 6:17 a.m. William heard the words from a great distance as if he were underwater and they were being spoken from the surface. He didn't move, didn't release Kate's hand, didn't acknowledge the doctor's quiet condolences. Carol began to cry, soft, broken sounds that came from the deepest part of her soul. Michael pulled her close, his own face crumpling with grief. They had lost their daughter, their brilliant, beautiful girl, and no amount of preparation could have readied them for this moment. The staff slipped quietly from the room, giving the family privacy. The doctor made notes that would become part of official records, death certificates, the formal documentation of tragedy. In houses around the world, preparations were already underway for announcements and protocols, but in this room there was only silence and loss. William stayed with Kate's body for over an hour, just holding her hand, looking at her face, trying to accept that she was gone. She looked peaceful, the lines of pain finally smoothed away. But the absence of life was unmistakable. The warmth was already fading from her skin, her chest completely still. His wife was dead, and he had no idea how to exist in a world without her. Eventually, Kate's parents gently suggested they needed to tell the children before they heard from anyone else. William nodded but couldn't seem to move. Carol helped him stand, guided him from the room on legs that barely supported him. Behind them, Michael remained with his daughter's body, unable to leave her yet, his hand resting on her still form. The children were awake, had been since they heard unusual movement in the house. They sat together on George's bed, knowing without being told that something had changed. When William entered the room, his face told them everything. George's expression crumbled. Charlotte began crying before anyone spoke. Louis looked from face to face, his confusion giving way to understanding and then to grief. William gathered them to him, all three holding them as they cried. He told them their mother was gone, that she had died peacefully in her sleep just as the sun came up. He told them she loved them, that her last thoughts had been of them. He promised they would get through this together, though he had no idea how that promise could possibly be kept. The hours that followed became a blur of activity. Phone calls to be made, statements to be released, family to be notified. Charles arrived within 2 hours, his own grief visible despite years of practiced composure. He embraced his son for long moments, both men crying without shame. But notably, Charles had come alone. Camilla had remained in London, citing the need to help coordinate official responses. The palace released a statement at noon, simple and dignified. The Princess of Wales had died peacefully at Anmer Hall surrounded by family. Further details would follow in due course. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Flowers began arriving within hours, thousands upon thousands of bouquets that would eventually number in the millions. People gathered outside palace gates to grieve collectively, to share their shock and sadness with others who felt the same. The media coverage was intense, but largely respectful. Kate's life was celebrated, her work honored, her loss mourned. Photographs from throughout her years in public life appeared everywhere, capturing her smile, her grace, her obvious love for her family. The world remembered her at her best, and for William that was both comfort and torture. The following days were consumed with funeral arrangements. State funeral protocol combined with personal wishes, creating something that would honor both Kate's public role and private self. The children were involved in decisions where appropriate, choosing flowers and music that reminded them of their mother. Camilla returned to London for the planning meetings, her presence creating tension in rooms already heavy with grief. She offered suggestions about protocol and precedents, observations about what would be expected. William barely acknowledged her, his entire being focused on getting through each moment without completely falling apart. There was a private viewing for family before the public funeral. William brought the children to say a final goodbye, to see their mother one last time. Kate lay in her coffin looking serene, dressed in her favorite blue, her hands folded peacefully. Charlotte placed a drawing she had made in the coffin. George added a letter he had written. Louis left his favorite stuffed animal, the one Kate had given him years ago, so his mother wouldn't be alone. The funeral itself was a grand affair, attended by royalty and dignitaries from around the world. Westminster Abbey filled with mourners, with people who had known Kate personally and others who had simply admired her from afar. The service was beautiful and heartbreaking, filled with music Kate had loved and readings that spoke to her faith and values. William walked behind the coffin with his children, their small figures heartbreaking in their formal mourning clothes. George stood straight and stoic, determined to be strong. Charlotte cried openly, supported by her grandfather Charles. Louis held his father's hand tightly, still not fully comprehending that his mother was really gone forever. The eulogy was delivered by Kate's brother, James, who spoke of his sister with love and humor, painting a picture of a real woman rather than just a royal icon. He talked about her laugh, her terrible singing voice, her competitive nature during family game nights. He made people remember Kate as a person, not just a princess, and the congregation laughed through their tears. As the service ended and the coffin was carried out, William stood at the altar for a long moment. He looked toward the casket containing his wife, his face a mask of devastation. This was real. This was happening. Kate was gone, and he was utterly, completely broken. In the front row, seated with the senior royals, Camilla watched the scene unfold. Her expression was composed, appropriate for the occasion. But as Kate's coffin passed by and William's anguish became impossible to ignore, something flickered across Camilla's face. It might have been sympathy. It might have been discomfort. Or it might have been something else entirely. Something that several people in attendance would later remember with a chill. Because in that moment of unbearable grief, as William stood broken by loss and the children sobbed for their mother, Camilla's lips curved ever so slightly upward, not into a full smile but into something that suggested satisfaction rather than sorrow. It was there for just a moment, so brief that many missed it, but those who saw it would never forget. The moment passed. Camilla's face returned to careful,